life, and you'll find it in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. It's an amazing story. We're going to give you an overview of it today, but maybe this week, take some time and open up your Bible and read it and go through it. You can go online. There's a great resource called Bible Gateway where you can go through and you can just download any version you want and to be able to work with that. But, the first thing I look about Joseph is that Joseph over and over again chose blessing over conflict. Now, let me be honest with you. Conflict is all around us. So if we're going to live as godly men in an ungodly world, the reality is there's conflict all around us, right? I mean, there's people fighting. I mean, maybe even your family, last night you were in the midst of a battle. And so you're like, yeah, I understand conflict. I go through that. Maybe you're at work, there's a lot of conflict. So how do you walk through that? Well, when we look at the beginning of the story in Genesis chapter 37, verse 3, it says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him." Guys, when you look at this, the father made the robe. He didn't go to Walmart or Target or JCPenney's and buy it. He made it. Think about that. That's the patriarch. That's like, this is the leader. He's actually sewing it together. Now, with it, a lot of times you talk about making the robe. It wasn't a tie-dye where he took different colors and splashed it. But what it was a robe made of different materials. And he stitched it all together. I want you to understand this. And this is probably when you look at the story of Joseph, this is amazing because the Old Testament tells stories that we call them typologies. In other words, you almost get a picture of what's coming later in the New Testament. And when you look here and you look at the life of Joseph, you look at a father that loved him. You see Jesus is like Joseph of the New Testament. And so when you look at the life of Joseph, you see that and how that kind of works through. I want you to understand that the Father loves you, and He covers you, and He covers you, and He gives you a robe of many, many colors. And actually, it's a robe of many material. So in other words, for some of your robes, there's different parts of our robe. And so maybe, Scott, it's made up of, this material. And maybe, when we look at it, maybe it's made up of this material, Sam. And so it's different pieces of different materials that are all kind of put together. Almost if you could think of like a quilt, a patchwork quilt. That's the robe of many colors. And you go, Tom, what's the deal with that? Because what happened in Joseph's life is that God took different swatches of his life and put it all together and made a great redemptive story. So when you look at your life, you look at your friend's life. Sam, I look at your life, and there's some different swatches of material. There's some swatches of material that you look at and go, man, I like that. That's great. There's some other swatches of material you go, you know what? I didn't like that swatch as much. Okay? But God puts it all together and makes a unique robe that's a Sam robe. And He takes that and He uses that in a redemptive thing in your life and in other people's lives. In other words, some of the different parts of the robe of Joseph's life were good things. Some of them were real negative things. But God put it all together and used it. And so that foreshadowing that you see even here at the beginning. So Joseph's given this robe. And it's a beautiful robe. And his brothers see it and they're pretty ticked at it. And so they hated it. In fact, one of the versions says they hated him even more. In other words, it's another level of hatred. And when you look at conflict, there's some conflict that just, it continues to escalate. And if somebody sees you getting favor, they may not like that. So, it's amazing, but, you can be in a group and you're with 10 other guys, and that one guy gets that promotion, and instead of the other guys slapping him on the back and say, man, that's a good job, they hate him even more, okay? And so those are the things. That's the flesh that comes in. That works within us. So in verse 37, verse 19, chapter 37, 19, it says this, "Here comes the dreamer." That's what his brothers said. They said to each other, "Come now, let's kill him." Boy, that's hate to another level. "Let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." There's dreams that you have that when people hear them, there's some that will celebrate it. But there will be also people that want to squash your dreams. Just recognize that. I mean, we see it thousands of years ago in the life of Joseph. It still happens today. And so there's conflict. And so they actually talk it through. How are we going to work through? What's this going to look like? But, Joseph, that's one life. How about you in your life? Take a look at this next slide here. It says, when we're going to look back, there's an expression that I have in church planning when I assess church planners. Past performance is the best future predictor. Okay, so when you look, if I'm an NFL general manager and I'm going to draft a player, I want to see what he did in college. If he sat the bench the whole college, then the reality of him doing something good in the pros is not real strong. He's not going to be a high draft pick. He's probably not going to be a draft pick. But if it's a guy that's done really well at the one level, so when I look at your life and we look at my life, we've got to learn from our past. So I'm not one of those touchy-feely guys that just, how did this make you feel? I just want you to recognize it. So here's the question. What was the last conflict that you were in? What was the last conflict you were in? So if you got a pen, write it down. Just say, yesterday, fought with my wife. Tuesday, had a conflict with my teenage son. Whatever it would be. So you've identified that you've had a conflict. Now, there are some of you that are in here and go, well, I never have a conflict. I never have a fight, okay? Whatever you want to call it. Disagreement, just whatever. So, the fact is that we are going to experience conflict. We're going to experience challenges in our life and walk through that. Do we have enough handouts? Did you guys get handouts? Are you good? Okay, so anybody else that needs a handout? So we got a bunch here. So, okay, you'll take it over, Sam, to him? There you go. Thanks, buddy. It's good. So when we look at this, how did you respond when it came? So in the midst of the conflict, how did you respond? So you might say, man, I responded as a man of God. Okay? You might say, man, I really blew it. You might say, I escalated it. For some of you might go, you know what, I totally avoided it. So just kind of identify where that's at. So you got that? So how do we respond to conflict? Because there's some conflict that we cause, and then there's some conflict that we just kind of step into. And it's like, okay, what do I do with it now? So there's a great organization called Peacemakers, and they came up with this, and I thought it was really, really helpful. Because Jesus talked about blessed be the peacemakers. So let's take a look at this next one here. Blessed are the peacemakers. And what this is I don't know if you've ever heard it before, but in the midst of a conflict, there's fight and flight reactions. Okay, so, if we look at this group here would be the group, maybe you say, we're the group that escapes. We run away. And so the escape mode. Look at 1 Kings chapter 19, gives a great example of that. It's another story in the Bible. It says, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah was a great prophet of God, all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So here's a guy that just, it was a major thing. It was like a huge battle conflict. He ends up with that, being the victor. And it said, then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me and more also if I do not make your life as the life of the one of them by this time tomorrow. In other words, I'm going to do to you what you did to these false prophets. So if I don't do this by tomorrow, and so what does he do? And so then Elijah was afraid and he arose, and what did he do? He ran for his life. This is a guy that God had just worked through in an amazing way, but when the flesh came in, he moved to the flight. He moved to the escape. And so for some of us, what we do whenever conflict happens, we just run away. We don't deal with it. We don't deal with it. How many of you, that's the way you normally respond to conflict? Okay? So one guy in the whole place. Come on, anybody else? Okay, thank you. So, kind of being able to work with that. Now, look at the next one here. So if you look back, blessed are the peacemakers. Again, there's the next one is attack mode. So, this side, the escape mode. This side here is the attack mode. So with this, next slide after this one here, guys. There you go. Fools give full vent to their rage, but the wise bring calm in the end. Okay, so a fool brings full vent to the rage. Next slide here. So when you look through that, this is the attack mode. What the attack mode does is they go for it. Now, I was brought up in Italian-Irish. I'm Italian-Irish. So, yeah, exactly. So, with that. But you know what? It's not good enough for me to blame it on my background. So I marry a real country girl, real sweet country girl, real sweet, like your wife Sherry, my wife Sherry, really sweet Scott. And so, we get married. And I'm like this Italian from Philadelphia, I am a Philadelphia Eagles fan. So, I mean, we're loud, we're boisterous. I've never thrown a battery at Santa or anything. But, with that, just there's that, and so it's like, okay, God, you need to redeem this in me. We get married. And I remember my wife and I, we got into an argument over something. And, she just got really quiet because that's what her family did. They just kind of like, coil up and put the head in the turtle shell kind of a deal. And just like until, for me, I'm like, oh, we need to talk about this. We need to work through this. Da, 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 da. And she's like, why are you yelling at me? I said, I'm not yelling at you. I'm just passionate. Well, the reality is like, God, you need to deal with this in my life because I can move into attack mode. God, help me not to do that and to work through that. So how many of you look at your life and go, you know what? Yeah, I can move into attack mode. Okay, any attack mode kind of guys here? So kind of working through that. So, those are two opposite of the spectrums. And the reality is that there's usually a default for us. Identify what your default is because they both have weaknesses. And then what the Bible's saying and what we should really do is move into the work it out mode where we work it out. And so you look at the verse, above all, love each other deeply because love covers over a multitude of sins. And so we move into that work it out mode. So the question I have for you is, how do you do that? Well, one of the first things is that there are some times in a work it out mode you've got to recognize you need to consciously overlook the offense. So, for instance, if, I remember when my girls were teenagers, there were certain things that were really important that we dealt with. But then there were some other things that were more preference. It's like, you know what? That's not worth going into World War III over. And Proverbs speaks about that. It says, it is to one's glory to overlook an offense. Proverbs 19:1. And so there's some battles not worth fighting for. And you need to evaluate that and decide, is that a hill I die on or is it not? But if you look at it and go, you know what? This is something I can't overlook. This is something I have to consciously have to deal with. Because the reality is that, for instance, in a marriage, my wife could probably, every day find something to be upset with me about. Because just how we are, her preferences and the whole bit. But, what is that thing that, so I don't know about you. I have a wife and I have two girls. And they tell that when I eat, I chew like a cow. Does anybody else have that kind of a thing? Okay. I'm like, you know what? That's what happens when you grow up in a house with women. Everybody's like real dainty and everything else like that. I just tell them I'm a carnivore. So when I eat. But, they've got to decide, so I try to kind of chew slow and with the mouth shut and the whole bit. But, just kind of, there's certain times, though, that it's just they've got to decide, are we going to make an issue of this or not? And we've got to do that in our life. But when you do have to talk about it, how do you do it? Talk about the offense privately. Matthew 18:15. If your brother or sister sins against you, go to them. Tell them what they did wrong. Keep it between the two of you. If they listen to you, you've won them back. And so you go to them privately. See, sometimes we just go into napalm mold. We just kind of bomb the whole thing. So if there's a problem, we get out there and we just tell everybody around us. In fact, one of the things we do is we do an end run, and instead of going to the person we have an issue with, we start going to everybody else about them instead of going to them. And that's really, when you look at that, that's not good. That will actually get us in a whole lot of trouble if we do that. So going to the person and talking to them and say, hey, you know what, let's talk about this. I don't want to embarrass you about this, but maybe there's a reason I'm not seeing it. It's not on my radar screen. And the Bible says that another thing to do is to, you've gone with them. If that's not resolved and you can't work with it, the next step is go get help. So, the way of fools seems right to them, but the wise listen to advice. And so sometimes what the Bible says, in fact, is that if Scott and I have an issue and we're kind of like, and it's just, and I go to Scott privately and say, Scott, you know what, we need to really talk through this, And Scott's like, man, he's putting up a wall. Then I'm like, okay, the Bible's saying I should bring somebody with me. So Sam, hey, can you come? I need you to help. Maybe I'm not seeing Scott right here. I'm not bringing somebody to gang up on Scott, but I'm bringing somebody that's going to help us work through this. See what I'm saying? You bring somebody with you. It's not saying it's not piling on. That's not what the Bible's teaching. But I bring somebody else and say, hey, we're not communicating here. Can you help us with this? And, with it, if we work through this, and Scott and I are still not walking in agreement, it's still an issue, and it's still an issue for me, then I need to go get help. I need to talk to somebody about it. And for some of us, these are issues that we've got to deal with and work through, and maybe the other person's not willing to work through it. They've set up a wall. There's no way they're going to change their minds. Then I need to figure out how I'm going to deal with this. What's my approach going to be? I need to settle it on my end. Because I need to get to a place where I'm not walking in the conflict and I'm not working under the curse, but now I'm able to start walking in blessing. Does that make sense? Because then I get to that place. Because what happens is we begin to take an account and we keep a score of everything this person does wrong. So Scott, using you as an example, forgive me, we had a great relationship. But, with Scott, maybe now every time he does something, I'm giving it the worst evaluation. See, that's not healthy. Because now whatever he does is going to be wrong, even when he tries to do things right. And so that's why you need to get help and not just sweep it under the carpet. So, looking forward, because looking back and saying, you know what, this is a cycle. I do this over and over again. By the way, if you're in conflict with your family, you're in conflict at work, you're in conflict at school, maybe it's not everybody else, right? So you go, what is my weakness here? That's why we look back. Past performance is the best future predictor. But once I know, okay, that's what I tend to do, I do that all the time, you got to look and say, how do I break this? I've got to consciously recognize it and break through this and change this. So looking forward, what steps will I take to develop more godly character in this area? So for me, early on, my kids were growing up. I didn't want to be the raging family. I've seen that modeled in my family, where people are like, every time we're with them, we're walking on eggshells. I'm like, you know what? I need to be able to discipline my girls, but do it in a way that's healthy. So there would be times that I'd go, okay, you need to go upstairs, time to get ready for bed. And they kind of dawdle along, not kind of taking me seriously. So normally, the old Italian way would be just like, okay, that's it, man. Just slap on the backside, get up there. That's, or just raging or whatever. Well, come on, really? You're going to do that over just not getting ready for bed as quick? So then I'd kind of just do the thing where I'd count to 3. Anybody done the count to 3 with your kids? Okay. So 1, 2, 3. At the end of 3, if they don't do it, then we deal with it at a different level. I had somebody once, I mentioned that once in a church, and somebody came up to me and said, I think you're teaching your kids delayed response. I said, no, I'm delaying my response. Because I need to be able to hit this the right way, not approach it, in the flesh. I want to do this in the spirit. So when you look at it, what are some of the things that you can do to kind of make sure that you're responding in the right way? So how you deal with conflict and how you work through that is huge. Another area is choosing integrity over compromise. And so, when you look at choosing integrity over compromise, look at what happens a little bit later. So Joseph ends up going into Potiphar's household. So he's sold into slavery. His brothers, have a bit of a discussion. A bunch of them want to kill him. One of the other brothers says, you know what, let's not kill him. Let's sell him into slavery. So, a caravan comes through. They sell him. He ends up in Egypt. He ends up in the house of the military leader, the head of the military. So he's like the guy, he is in charge of the house. He becomes the servant, does a good job. Joseph's work ethic continues to get him promoted through life. You see it over and over again when you read his story in Genesis. So he's in charge of Potiphar's house, and he's given trust over the whole house. Well, Potiphar's wife, when the military leader's he's away, this is what happens. Now, Joseph was well-built and handsome, and after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me, and he refused. I know what it's like to be well-built and handsome. Yeah. Okay, my wife says, you need to get in shape. I tell her round is a shape. But he gets seduced. He gets seduced. And what does he do? He refuses. He refuses. And he says this, with me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he's entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? It's really interesting, but when you read through, he recognized the fact that if I sin against my master, I'm not just sinning against my master, I'm sinning against God. And so recognizing, I mean, there's parallels. There's our relationship with one another. When we sin, it's the relationship with one another, but it's also a relationship with God. And it goes on in verse 10, it says, and though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her and even to be with her. So tremendous integrity. So here's the question for you, looking back, guys. What were the triggers the last time I faced temptation? So look at because a lot of times what happens is that, in our life, I was going to originally ask the question, when was the last time you faced temptation? But, with that, I want you to go a little further. Think about the last time you faced temptation. What were the triggers for that? Because what I've often found is that sometimes we put ourselves in a position where over and over again we allow ourselves to be tested. So what were the triggers for that? Take a look at what were the triggers. So for instance, sometimes our triggers are we're tired. Sometimes the triggers are we're up late, we're isolated. Sometimes our triggers are we're worn out from work. Sometimes the triggers are, I haven't had any time with God during the whole week. I've just I haven't prayed, I haven't read my Bible, and so I've kind of opened myself up and I've allowed a lot of other stuff into my spirit. So some of those triggers, if you're watching Game of Thrones, okay, and so you're watching that and you're pulling that into your spirit, there's going to be things that are going to affect you that, in terms of you're going to think these things are okay behaviors. And so when you look at that, all of those things can be triggers. And let's face it, guys, we're up against an awful lot. So there's an awful lot we can face in talking about this, but I'm going to tell you the area where a lot of guys right now are failing. It's the internet. Okay, so just with that, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but the question is, what are we doing to protect? So there's a few things that I recommend because I want you to walk away with a few tools. How many of you right now currently have an internet filter on your computer? I'm just curious. Okay, raise them high if you have one on your computer. Okay, that's a very small percentage for this group. Let me just say that with that, some of you may say, how many of you do not have a computer? Okay, so you don't need an internet filter on your computer because you don't have a computer, okay? And you go, well, I don't have a computer, but I have a smartphone. Guess what? Computer. Okay, so kind of walking through that. But as you look through, here's one of the things that I really recommend. Take a look at this, K9 Web Protection. This is a free software that will block content. So if you're searching and you're searching for something pornographic, okay, it should block. It'll block a lot of it. Now, I'll be honest with you. Guys have told me, well, you know what, you can work the system, you can game it and do a couple of these things here. But the reality is that you want to make it as hard as it is to get into the house. Okay, so this is a free filter that you can download. It was developed for schools and for companies, and they make it available for home usage as well. So this would be great, especially in your home. You got a computer, everybody in the house uses it, you put this on, and it won't be too long until somebody comes to you and go, you know what, I was just kind of like Googling, and this blocker came up. Do you know what that is? Yeah, that's just making sure nothing gets into our house that we don't want here. Okay, so and with that, it's free. So guys used to say, well, I don't have the money for it. Okay, there's free. When you look at it, here's something from Covenant Eyes. This is another filter that with this, you can add this to like smartphones, and you can buy an account that will cover multiple different computers. This is a paid service, Covenant Eyes, but take a look at the statistics. And so with that, let me just read these statistics for you. 95% of all teens are online. 78% own a smartphone. Here's a scary thing. 93% of boys and 63% of girls view porn before age 18. It used to be we would just talk about the guys all the time, but recognize you got to protect your girls too. And then the next part here, age 11 is the average age that somebody first views porn. 11. Dads, when do a lot of us have the sex talk? When they're 16. Guess what? We need to start talking about some of these things earlier. So, at age 11, and when you look at the next part, between ages 12 to 17, the largest consumer group of porn, okay, the teenagers. That doesn't surprise. But when you think through that, one of the reasons why dads don't have these conversations and don't put the filters on their computer is that for some of us, we deal with this temptation, and so we don't feel we're on a moral high ground to talk to our families about it. And that's the honest thing. And so when we look through it and say, God, I want to walk pure. So Covenant Eyes asked this question: what's your game plan online? What's your game plan online? How do you develop that? And so there's a few things that I have. For instance, I have Covenant Eyes. I use Covenant Eyes, and with it, Covenant Eyes will send a report to an accountability partner. And I've got a guy that I meet with about every 3 weeks or so, and we've been doing this for years. It's a relationship that I have with him, and he's honest with me, and I'm honest with him, and we're just like, you know what? I want to walk in purity in this way. Because let's face it, I'm the men's director for the district. Okay, if I fall into this trap, I don't just go down. I take a lot of guys with me, and I don't want to go that route. I want to live holy and pure before God. So when I look through this, it's like I want to look at my partner in the eyes and just say, hey, you know what, this is the area. Some guys will use their wife in this, and they'll ask their wife to be their accountability partner. And if it's working for you, God bless you. I'll let you know, though, that I don't necessarily want my wife to be in a role where she has to feel she's always on the lookout and on guard for me. You know what I'm saying? It puts her in a different situation. But with this, I've got that relationship with him. So with that, there's a report. It'll issue, hey, report looks good, okay? It'll issue, with it, it'll allow me to block out certain times of usage. Because sometimes what happens is it's through boredom, we can be online a lot of time, and then curiosity gets the best and can take you to an area you don't want to go. So this is huge to make sure that you get this under control. In addition, we'll talk about other things. For instance, when we travel, my friend told me, he said, hey, I'm going to be on a business trip for 3 days. I want to talk about just what I watch when I'm in that hotel room. I look right now, we've been off of, we don't have cable TV. Back in August, we scrapped it. I was away for a few weeks. I said, you know what, I'm just going to cancel the service to keep escalating the price. There's a lot more that I can do with $100 a month. And so with that kind of, we went without it for months, and I think now we just have one of those plans. I'd call them up, and I'm like, okay, so if I get back online, did the research, and here's what they're doing. We're going to throw in 12 months free of premium channels. Wow, that's great. I can have R-rated movies and mature audience movies just kind of like right here in my house. Isn't that awesome? Like, no, thank you. No, thank you. Well, then it's going to cost you more money. I'm like, what? And they're like, well, for us not to give you the package with free HBO, it costs this much money because we bundle it all together. You've got to be kidding me. So it's like, you know what? Forget it. I'm not going there. So, we don't have that, and just kind of, but it's changed how we spend our time.
I get 50-some channels up the road here, 3 miles up the road here, with an antenna and rotor for free. Well, it cost me around $500 to set everything up initially, and I got several sets. Everything I get is off the air or off the video.
Well, that's awesome to be able to get that and to get that many channels. I set up Leaf. It's a Leaf antenna. I got it at Best Buy. It cost me about $50, and I got Leaf 50, which is a 50-mile radius. And I'm Central Pennsylvania, so I can't pull in some of the Philadelphia market as much, or New York. But what I am able to pull in is I think I get about 12 channels. So I get the major networks, so I can watch the news for the blizzard that's coming the way, and I can watch my Eagles lose. So yeah. But those are some things. Also, by the way, if you do have cable, one of the things you can do is you can set up in your settings that limits no R-rated movies, nothing with, no mature audience type things. And so, because what I've heard guys say, I'm just surfing through and I just came across it. Okay, well, just screen it out so you don't get it. You're like, well, wait a minute, why would I do that? Because you don't want it. It's integrity, so walking with that. So, so what's your game plan? Developing a game plan. By the way, we do a conference in October, and it'll be in this year, Lutherville, Maryland. How many have been to the Band of Brothers before? So a few of you have been there. Would love to have you. This is in October. We have 1,500 guys that come out to this. Brian Cuck from Reading is actually going to be one of our keynote speakers this coming year. But we talk about some of the issues that guys face and just kind of say, hey, we want to give you good tools, and we want you to walk in purity in these areas. So, but here's the question for you looking forward. What steps will I take to develop more godly character in this area? In the area of sexual temptation, what are you going to do? And you go, okay, my area, maybe you're not dealing with this. Maybe T.D. Jakes did a series he called it PMS. It was a men's retreat series, and he called it PMS. He said, men PMS too. We're like, really? What's this about? Power, money, and sex. So, getting a hold of those three areas of your life. So when you look at that in your own life, what are some of the things that you say, okay, here's a step that I'm going to take to kind of move into a good area in this? And maybe it's beginning to have a conversation with somebody you trust and being able to say, hey, this is what I'm facing in my life. Here's the next one. Joseph chose stewardship over debt. He was a good steward. That's why he kept getting promoted. In Genesis chapter 41, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. So the Pharaoh had a dream, and in the midst of the dream, Joseph was in prison. They heard that he can interpret dreams, brought him in. Joseph gave him a game plan. Pharaoh's dream was very disturbing to him. And with the dream, here's the interpretation. 7 years of great abundance are coming. So there's the 7 fat cows throughout the land of Egypt. But 7 years of famine will follow them. That's the 7 lean cows, skinny cows, ugly, sick cows, ate the 7 fat cows. Then all the abundance of Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. By the way, this isn't just Egypt. There are economic cycles. So right now, you're like, hey, last year it was great. Boy, the return on my stock, dividends were super, okay? January, if you looked at your statement, if you got one, if you got money invested, it's like, well, maybe I didn't do as well. Maybe I shouldn't have invested in energy now that it's selling for under $2 a gallon in gas. But and when you look through those kind of things, there's cycles. And so recognizing the cycles, it goes on. Real estate's another cycle, and recognizing that. So, and now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. So he's telling them, take a portion. So in this case, it says take 20%. By the way, when we look at this, one of the things is godly men. Let me encourage you men to tithe. And you go, why would I give 10%? The reality is that it all belongs to God. 100%. It all belongs to God. The 10% that I give back reminds me of who's got the other 90% and how I spend that. And by the way, last week, did anybody have church last week? Most of our services were canceled. Here's how you know whether or not you're a disciple or just a consumer. Consumers, when they go to church tomorrow, they'll put money in, they'll go, here's my $5, and they'll put that in the offering, okay, because I'm here. We basically say, I'm going to pay, maybe I'll give 10 because that's what it would cost if I went to a movie, okay? Disciples say, you know what? I missed last week. This church still has expenses. They still have to pay the light bill, still have salaries and working through that. So they say, you know what? Here's double. I'm paying my tithe from last week and this week, okay? That's just kind of working through that. So we have a consumer mindset or a discipleship mindset. And all the pastors said, amen. But, when we look through that and just say, God, help us to be good stewards. I think it's a great plan. If you look and you say, I'm going to take 20%. I'm going to give 10% to invest in eternal rewards in heaven. And I'm going to take 10% and I'm going to invest that so that it's saving for a rainy day and walking through that. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. You know what? When I look at that, I tithe the whole thing. So that personally I look at it and say, you know what? Why would I give God after the government's taken his cut? So when you look at that and just say, okay, how do I work off of that? So that's my personal thing. But you know what? If pastors would be happy if you tithe off of either of those, because most guys aren't tithing at all. Okay, so, but when you look at it and say, you know what? Why would I give Obama and more money and that cut? I'm going to just take off my, this is God giving me this. That's going first. So I think when we look and we put the big rocks in place first. But with that, it's a great question. And for some of you say, I'm looking at everything and I can't. Just get started. Just get started. So, you go, okay, I want to get up to this point, and I'm going to just begin moving in that direction. So, working through that. Because to be honest with you, some of us have a lot of problems financially and working through that. So, guys, in the next few minutes, I'm going to take you through this real quick. Dave Ramsey, Total Money Makeover. My wife read the book, and I had to cancel a vacation after she read the book because she won't let me spend the money. Here's what he says. First thing is list all your debts. List them all. The reason why a lot of us are, because we, remember the whole conflict thing? We don't want to talk about money, so we run away. We don't even know. We know it's a lot of money, but we don't even have it. List it. Write it all down and work through that. So here's the question. Looking back, what's your current debt right now? So that's an interesting thing to figure out what is my current debt? By the way, monitor your accounts. There's an app, by the way, that's really good. It's called Credit Karma. So Karma. No, it's not going to do yoga on your phone or anything like that, okay? I wish they would have chosen a different name. There's nothing mystical about it. It's going to give you numbers of what accounts you have, what are the liens, what do you owe on your car loan, what do you owe on your mortgage. It's scary and spooky. Does anybody have this on their phone, by the way, Credit Karma? Okay, a few of you do. Okay, really good thing. I encouraged guys, 2 years ago, I encouraged one of my friends to get this. He went and put it on his phone, and he looked, and when he went to Credit Karma, he recognized an account that was not an account. Somebody had actually opened up a credit card account in his name. So it helped him to be able to work through that. But it'll let you know, too, what your credit score is and working through all those things. The next thing Dave Ramsey says is set up a $1,000 emergency fund. So the reason why some of us use credit as much as we do is because we have no cushion. No cushion. So I picked my car up for inspection yesterday, $193. I mean, if they would have told me and they would have said, hey, you know what, you need this, it's going to be $600 more, it's like, what do we normally do? Take out the credit card, just charge it in a whole bit because we have no margin to pay out of. So he says, set up $1,000. If you want the points, you're going to pay it off at the end of the month, but make sure you got the money to go through that with that. So with that, you've set up, you go, where do I get the $1,000 from? Maybe work a side job. Maybe with that, spring's coming, do a yard sale. He actually says this. He said, sell so much stuff that your kids think they're next. Okay? So being able to work with that. And then the other thing is pay the smallest first. Anybody, what about Bob? Baby Steps. I love that movie. But for some of you, what happens is that when you write and you see the list, you're going to be so demotivated that you're going to run again. You're going to just run away and say, I'm going to ignore it again. I'm going to put my head in the shell, and I'm going to just pretend it all goes away. What he says is look at where it is and pay the smallest debt first, because then you get a little encouragement with that, okay? So,
Some say that you should go with the highest interest rate.
yeah, they do, and that's really good to ask that. The reality is that if you're disciplined, you're probably not carrying a huge debt load. The problem is that most of us get in high debt because we do it off of emotion. And so you almost need to create emotion of a win. So if your highest debt load, okay, is $10,000 on a Discover card, and then you discover that it's not just the card that pays you back, but they want money back too. When you look at that $10,000, you're like, okay, what are we going to do with this? But you have another one that's maybe, so Discover's charging you 21.9% interest, but you have another card that's charging you 11.9%, but that's $1,000. It would tell logically that you pay the 20% off, but because you're so under with that, the reality is pay off the $1,000 first so you feel good about paying something off, and then you take what you've been paying into that and you stream into the next highest, and then you get some momentum of some success behind you. Okay, great book, Total Money Makeover, and but walking through that. So looking forward, what steps am I going to take to develop more godly character in the area of finances? Don't ignore it if your finances are a shamble. Take that step, and so whatever that might be. Here's the last one for you. Choose forgiveness over bitterness. Choosing forgiveness over bitterness. The reality is that unforgiveness in our heart is toxic. So think about this. This is amazing. Joseph becomes number 2 in charge. Because he was wise in how he used money, he was given Pharaoh said, I'm going to make you in charge of all of this. Really cool. You talk about godly character, that was really good. But now, Egypt, when the famine hits, they're the only ones with the food because they were the only ones that saved for the rainy day. And so what happens is Abraham, they all come, not Abraham, but his kids, his sons, his brothers, Joseph's brothers, the ones that left him sold him into slavery, we're going to kill him. Now, they have to appear for him for food. Look at chapter 45. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one who sold you into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. It's pretty interesting, but he caught something bigger. He walked in forgiveness instead of taking it out on his brothers. That's pretty strong. So for some of us, we've been living as a victim all our life. God wants you to be a victor. And you're not going to get to victor unless you've been able to deal with an area of bitterness that you're holding on to. So, question, who am I holding on to bitterness towards? And you go, but if I let them off my hook, they're still on God's hook. They're going to still have to deal. But now I'm not carrying that toxic stuff in my life. So my family tree in my life, I've had so many dads. Okay, my family tree is a family shrub. I've had 3 dads in my life. Dad number 1, mom and dad got a divorce when I was 5. Dad number 2, helicopter, and I didn't see him again, by the way, until I got married. 20 years later, invited him to my wedding. Okay, and now he's a Christ follower, serving the Lord. It's amazing what God did to a guy that, but anyway, dad number 2, helicopter pilot, shot and killed in Vietnam. Dad number 3, we found out, wasn't just one affair, but 2 other women. It devastated us. It was at that point that we found Christ. Here's the amazing thing, that in the midst of that, in the midst of all of that, we recognized that Jesus Christ worked through all those negative things to bring us to a place where we're able to be dependent on Him. I don't know what you're facing in your life, but saying, God, you know what? I give this to you. I'm letting go. And so that last thing here, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about so that many should be kept alive as they are today. So what steps do you need to take to let go of bitterness? Let's pray. Father, a lot of different issues that we've talked about this morning. Guys, I want you to real quick think of what's that one area out of the ones that we talked about. Maybe it's that area of choosing blessing over conflict. Maybe it's choosing integrity over compromise. Maybe it's choosing hope over disappointment, stewardship over debt. Maybe it's coming to that place of forgiveness over bitterness. God, you see that one key area that we need to center our focus on today.